In the suffocating summer of 1856, deep in rural Texas, there existed an event slave owners simply called the race. This was no competition. It was a scheduled massacre, bloody entertainment for wealthy men bored with lives of luxury built upon the suffering of others. During 3 nights of the new moon each year, planters from across the South converged on Blackwater Plantation with pockets full of gold and souls empty of humanity. The rule was simple and brutal. At 9 o'clock at night, 10 enslaved men were released into the swamp. At 9:15, the hunters set out after them. White men on horseback, armed with rifles and accompanied by packs of dogs trained to tear human flesh. The betting began weeks in advance. How long would the fastest one survive? How many bodies would be recovered by morning? Which master owned the most resilient slave? In 7 years, no one had ever survived the Blackwater race. 70 black men had been thrown into that swampy hell over its existence. 70 men had died, shot, drowned, torn apart by dogs, or simply swallowed by the mud and the night. Their bodies fed the alligators. Their names were forgotten before dawn. And the next morning, while house slaves cleaned blood from the master's boots, life on the plantations continued as if nothing had happened. But in the 8th year, something changed. Among the 10 men chained in the yard of Blackwater Plantation that June night, there was one the other slaves called simply Abel. His back carried the scars of 200 lashes. His eyes had witnessed the sale of his wife and children to distant plantations. His hands knew only work and pain, but his mind had been busy for months, plotting something no slave owner could imagine. While the white men drank imported whiskey and counted stacks of gold coins by lantern light, while they adjusted their weapons and fed their dogs raw meat to awaken their hunger, Abel looked at the 9 other men beside him. And they all looked back, because they all knew this night would be different. This night, the hunters would become the hunted. Before we continue with this shocking story, tell me which city you are watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Let's continue. Sprawling across 3,000 acres of East Texas wilderness, the Blackwater Plantation was where pine forests gave way to cypress swamps, and the land itself seemed to hold secrets in its dark waters. Colonel James Whitmore had inherited the property from his father, along with 147 human beings he considered livestock. But the colonel had grown tired of cotton and tobacco. He craved something more stimulating than profit margins and harvest reports. That's when he conceived the race. The first year, in 1849, had been almost accidental, a drunken wager between Whitmore and 3 neighboring planters about whose slaves could run fastest through the swamp. By the second year, word had spread across the South. Wealthy men arrived from as far as Charleston and New Orleans, bringing their finest horses, their deadliest weapons, and their most disposable property. The event became legend in the shadowy world of the plantation elite. Whispered about in gentlemen's clubs, discussed over cigars and brandy, but never mentioned in polite society or in the presence of Northern abolitionists. The swamp itself was perfect for the purpose. 2 miles deep and 3 miles wide, it was a labyrinth of black water, cypress knees, quicksand pits, and predators, both reptilian and insect. A man could disappear there and never be found. Many had. But while Colonel Whitmore thought he controlled every aspect of his twisted game, he had made one critical miscalculation. He believed the men he sent into that swamp were broken, defeated, too terrified and exhausted to think beyond their own survival. He never imagined they could plan. He never considered they might communicate. He never dreamed they could organize. And he certainly never suspected that his own house slaves, the ones he trusted to serve his meals and shine his boots, were part of the conspiracy. 3 months before the 8th annual race, Abel had been sold to Blackwater Plantation for $800. He arrived in chains, his body emaciated from weeks on the auction circuit, his spirit supposedly crushed by the loss of his family. Colonel Whitmore considered it a bargain, a prime field hand at nearly half the going rate of $1,500 for a healthy male slave in his late 20s. Abel's reputation as a troublemaker had lowered his value significantly. He had attempted escape twice before at his previous plantation in Louisiana. He had been caught both times and punished with 100 lashes each time, the scars crisscrossing his back like a brutal map of resistance and defiance. What the colonel didn't know was that Abel had learned something during those failed escape attempts. He had learned patience. He had learned to watch, to listen, to gather information while appearing defeated and broken. And most importantly, he had learned that freedom achieved alone was no freedom at all, not when it meant leaving brothers and sisters behind in bondage, not when it meant your own liberation was built on the continued suffering of others who had helped you, sheltered you, kept your secrets. On his third day at Blackwater, while working in the cotton fields under the brutal June sun that turned the air thick as honey, Abel heard two overseers discussing the race. They spoke casually, laughing about the previous year's event, about how the betting pool had reached $20,000 in gold coin and banknotes, about how one man had made it almost a mile before the dogs caught him and tore open his legs, about how another had tried to hide underwater in a cypress hollow and drowned when he stayed under too long. The overseers found it all tremendously amusing, slapping their thighs and wiping tears of laughter from their eyes. They mentioned that Colonel Whitmore himself had won $4,000 on a bet that no slave would survive past midnight, proving once again that the colonel knew his property better than anyone. Abel said nothing. He kept his head down, his hands moving steadily through the cotton bolls, filling his sack with the white fiber that built Southern fortunes. But his mind was racing, calculating, remembering every word. That evening in the slave quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins behind the main house where the enslaved population lived in conditions barely fit for animals, Abel sat quietly while the other men and women ate their meager rations of cornmeal and salt pork. The portions were carefully measured to provide just enough nutrition to keep them working, but never enough to satisfy the constant gnawing hunger. He listened to their conversations, learning names, relationships, hierarchies, the invisible social structure that existed beneath the surface of plantation life. There was Samuel, a massive man who worked as the plantation blacksmith, worth at least $2,000 because of his specialized skills in metalwork and repair. There was Moses, quick and clever, who tended the colonel's horses, including a thoroughbred stallion valued at $3,000 that had been shipped from Kentucky. There was Isaiah, who had been at Blackwater longer than anyone else, 15 years of unbroken servitude that had left him gaunt but observant, his value diminished to perhaps $500 due to age and visible exhaustion. There was Caleb, young and strong at 22 years old, purchased just months earlier from a plantation in Alabama for $1,200. His youth and strength made him valuable for the hardest field work. There was Ruth, one of the house slaves, who cleaned the colonel's study and overheard conversations the white men thought were private. Her value was set at $1,000 despite her ability to read and write, skills she kept carefully hidden because literacy in a slave was considered dangerous. Abel watched them all carefully. He said little during those first weeks, establishing himself as quiet and compliant, never drawing attention to himself. He worked hard, never complained, never met the eyes of white men directly, performed every task with mechanical efficiency. The overseers began to relax around him, convinced that the whippings at his previous plantation had finally broken whatever defiant spirit he once possessed. They stopped watching him as closely, stopped checking on him as frequently. And that was exactly what Abel wanted. Invisibility was a kind of freedom, the freedom to observe without being observed, to plan without being suspected. It was Ruth who approached him first. She came to his cabin on a moonless night 2 weeks after his arrival, moving silently through the darkness like a ghost. Abel had been lying on his rough straw mattress, staring at the ceiling through gaps in the wooden planks, when her shadow appeared in his doorway. The cabin was barely 10 feet square, with walls that didn't quite meet the roof and a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained. 6 men slept there, packed together. But that night, Abel was alone because the others were working a night shift in the sugar house. "You planning something?" she whispered. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Abel remained still, unsure if this was a trap. House slaves sometimes reported to the master in exchange for small privileges, an extra piece of meat, a warmer blanket, a day without work. The masters called them good slaves and rewarded their betrayals, while the other enslaved people called them something else entirely. Ruth seemed to read his thoughts. "I ain't no informer. I've been here 6 years. I seen 3 races. I seen 30 men go into that swamp. 30 men who never came back. One of them was my brother. His name was Daniel. He was 16 years old. The dogs got him in the first hour. I heard him screaming from the main house where I was serving brandy to the men who bet on how long he'd last." Abel sat up slowly in the faint starlight coming through the gaps in the cabin walls. He could see her face clearly now, the hatred burning in her eyes like hot coals, the same hatred he carried in his own chest like a permanent weight. "I heard the overseers talking about you," Ruth continued, her voice barely audible even in the silence. "Said you tried to run twice before at the merchant plantation in Louisiana. Said you took 100 lashes each time and didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't break. Said you're either the bravest fool they ever seen or the most dangerous. I think you're dangerous. And I think you're planning something for the race." Abel studied her for a long moment, weighing the risk. Then he nodded once, slowly, committing himself to trust, because without trust, there could be no plan, no resistance, no chance. "The colonel keeps his guns in a cabinet in his study," Ruth said quickly, as if she'd been waiting months to share this information. 6 rifles, 4 pistols, all loaded and ready. The key hangs on a hook behind his desk, right next to the portrait of his father. Every night after dinner, he drinks a bottle of bourbon, sometimes 2 if he's had a good day. By 10 o'clock, he can barely walk straight. The overseers play cards in the barn until midnight, drinking corn whiskey and betting pocket money. There are 12 dogs in the kennel, but only one handler sleeps nearby in a small room attached to the kennel, and he's deaf in his left ear from a hunting accident 5 years ago. Abel felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Dangerous, treacherous hope that could get you killed if you believed in it too much. But also the only thing that made survival worthwhile. "How many others know?" he asked quietly. "Samuel knows. Moses knows. Isaiah been talking about it for years. But he never had nobody willing to lead. Nobody crazy enough to try. There's others, too. People who work in the house, people who move around the property. Maybe 10, 12 people total who would help if they thought there was a real chance. We've been waiting for someone like you." Over the following weeks, Abel moved carefully through the plantation, making contact with each person Ruth had mentioned. They met in small groups, never more than 3 at a time, always in different locations to avoid establishing a pattern that might be noticed. In the blacksmith shop, where the ring of hammer on anvil covered their whispered conversations, in the tobacco drying barn, where the thick leaves absorbed sound and created shadowy spaces, in the cistern behind the kitchen, where the splash of water being drawn masked their voices. Each meeting was brief, purposeful, focused on gathering information and building trust. Samuel the blacksmith became essential to their plan. He was a thoughtful man despite his size, someone who had spent years working with metal and fire, understanding how things could be shaped and transformed. He began setting aside pieces of scrap iron, shaping them secretly into crude but effective weapons, a blade attached to a wooden handle that could pierce flesh, a spike that could be driven through bone, lengths of chain that could strangle or be used to bind. He worked slowly, carefully, never taking so much material that it would be noticed, never working on the weapons when anyone was watching. Over 8 weeks, he accumulated enough weapons for 10 men, hiding them in 3 separate locations around the property, buried in oilcloth to prevent rust, placed where they could be retrieved quickly when needed. Moses studied the horses and the layout of the property with an expert eye. He had been working with animals since childhood and understood their behavior, their fears, their instincts. He reported that the colonel owned 8 horses, all kept in the main stable near the house. The thoroughbred stallion was worth more than any 3 slaves combined, and the colonel guarded it jealously, checking on it personally every evening. But the other horses were often left unsupervised after dark, their stable doors closed but not locked, the assumption being that no slave would dare try to steal a horse because the punishment was death by hanging. Moses also mapped the swamp entrances, identifying which paths led to quicksand and which were relatively safe, information gathered over years of retrieving game birds the white men had shot during hunting expeditions. He knew where the water was shallow enough to wade through and where it dropped suddenly to depths of 8 or 10 feet. He knew which cypress trees had roots you could stand on and which concealed sinkholes that would swallow a man whole. Isaiah, despite his age and exhaustion, despite the way his hands shook from years of brutal labor, proved to have the sharpest memory of anyone Abel had ever met. He recounted every detail of the previous 7 races, describing the exact timing, the positions of the hunters, the routes the fleeing men had taken. He remembered that the hunters always split into 3 groups, one circling left around the swamp's perimeter, one circling right, one driving straight through the middle in a wedge formation. He remembered that the dogs were always released first, always from the eastern side of the swamp, where the ground was firmest and allowed them to build up speed. He remembered that the colonel himself never entered the swamp, instead watching from a raised platform near the starting point, a wooden structure about 8 feet high that gave him a clear view of the initial chase. From that platform, he collected bets from latecomers and distributed winnings to those who had guessed correctly about survival times and death methods. Last year's race had drawn 17 plantation owners with a betting pool of $23,000 in gold and banknotes, the largest sum yet assembled for the event. Ruth continued to serve in the main house, listening to every conversation, reading every letter left carelessly on the colonel's desk, observing the rhythms and routines of the white family and their guests. She learned that this year's race was scheduled for June 15th, 16th, and 17th during the new moon, when darkness would be complete and the hunting would be most challenging. She learned that invitations had been sent to planters across 5 states, each one hand-delivered by trusted servants. She learned that the colonel had bragged to his peers about acquiring fresh stock, including a troublemaker from Louisiana who was sure to provide exciting sport, a clear reference to Abel himself. She learned that the entry fee for hunters had been raised to $500 per night, with all proceeds going into the prize pool, making this year's event potentially the most lucrative yet. The colonel expected this year's race to be the largest yet, perhaps drawing 30 participants and a betting pool exceeding $40,000. But most importantly, Ruth learned something the colonel had mentioned casually over dinner one evening, something he considered insignificant but which changed everything about Abel's planning. This year, for the first time, the colonel planned to allow the selected slaves to spend the afternoon before the race unchained, to let them build up hope before crushing it in the swamp. He believed this psychological torture would make the event more entertaining, that men who spent hours contemplating possible escape routes would run harder, fight more desperately, provide better sport for the paying audience. The idea had come from one of his guests the previous year, a plantation owner from Mississippi who claimed to have extensive experience in managing slave psychology for optimal performance. Subscribe the channel. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Where are you joining from? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's return to the story.